People don't want to talk about it. They don't even want to hear about it. Yet if the same number of children suffered from a disease, alarms would sound against the epidemic. Totally accurate statistics are impossible to formulate when you figure that 50% of child abuse victims don't even remember they were abused, and 90% will never even mention it. But according to many studies, 1 out of 4 girls and 1 out of 7 boys will be abused by the time they're 18. We start to lose ourselves in those numbers. Some have calculated that that means that there's 50 million abuse victims in the United States alone. That's about 12 times the amount of Jehovah's Witnesses there are worldwide. Incest is easily the greatest single underlying reason why women seek treatment. And judging from the unprecedented reaction from the October 8th, 1991 Awake, it affects the congregations as well, too. And since it's probably the most crippling experience that a child can endure, you begin to see why women of our day and men are challenged. The magnitude of this distressing problem, even here in the congregation, demands that we address it. Now, the focus of this part will not be on healing the wounds of child abuse. This is a foundation for a part that will be coming in the future. In Joel chapter 3, verse 3, it indicates that in Bible times, children were abused for sexual gratification by adults. And didn't the Apostle Paul tell Timothy that in our time, men would be lovers of themselves, having no natural affection, no self-control, no love of goodness, and fierce? And these people are parents. They raise children, or their relatives are children. Well, what exactly is sexual abuse? First, the emotions evoked by all forms of abuse, whether it's verbal, physical, neglect, or emotional abuse, they all can manifest themselves in the same ways. So the information here applies to all kinds of abuse. But since it takes so little of the kind of sexual abuse to cause so much damage, and it's one of the most shaming, inducive kind of abuses, that's why we discuss it today. What is sexual abuse? Well, first you think of the physical kind. That's the hand-on, sexualized hugs and kisses, anal or oral sex, or intercourse. Then there's the more overt, non-touch kind of sexual abuse. Voyeurism, exhibitionism, exposure to pornography, exposure to the sexual activity of parents in the home. Or there's a more covert abuse, inappropriate sexual talking, being called sexual names, jokes about sexual parts. And then adults will violate the child's boundaries, leaving no privacy, breaking in when they go to the bathroom or when they're getting dressed. Then there's the very insidious, emotional incest. It's crazy-making. Never does the person touch the child, but the bonding is inappropriate. The father may view his little princess more like a spouse than his child. Those are words, and you think about them, and they touch you. But here's an experience to illustrate how painful even non-physical sexual abuse can be. One woman named Greta lived in terror through her teenage years because of her stepfather's teasing and sexual innuendos. She said, "I was never sure whether he'd try something or not. He'd always make remarks about my body. He never touched me, but would do this creepy thing of coming in my room and just stand there chuckling. I was terrified. I told my mother," she said. But her reply was, "Come back to me if he ever tries anything." The effect was then magnified. Researchers quibble and split hairs over definitions of what sexual abuse is. Our purpose tonight is not to define it for a courtroom or a judicial committee. The most important thing in understanding its effect is the effect that it has on the child. It's the experience of the child. And the effects appear to depend on the child's response to real or threatened touch, and the conclusions that the child draws about themselves and their world because of it. Who are the abusers? Fathers, stepfathers, uncles, brothers, grandparents, neighbors, family, friends, babysitters, teachers, strangers, sometimes aunts and mothers. Is there a difference between an incest offender and a child molester? An incest offender is a child molester who stays home. Why is it so devastating? One of our sisters' fleshly brother recently wrote her a letter about their childhood while they lived with some relatives. He said, when you have to live in daily terror of the rage or abuse by a family member who smiles and is kind to everyone else, you've got to figure you must be wrong. He says, what makes the assault from within the family so terribly costly and painful is that if we tell our family that we're assaulted by a criminal on the way home from school, we would likely be believed, and the family may gather around and express regret. But in the home, there is secrecy, denial, shame, and disbelief. Then he closes, it destroys the foundation of trust, and that's what sexual abuse does. It is the ultimate betrayal of the most basic trust that a child has with a parent. And it does invade every facet of their life. And usually, the victim is totally dependent on the aggressor. That's why incest is one of the cruelest and most baffling human experiences. Look, Ecclesiastes 7:7 says, if mere oppression may make a wise man act crazy, if that's true, for an adult, imagine the effect on a small child when done by a trusted parent. It's said that at least victims of the Holocaust could hate their enemy and knew who they were. The SS stormtroopers made no bones about being the enemy. Childhood is the time when Jehovah intended the emotional and spiritual development of the person. That's where they would develop moral boundaries. That's where they'd get their personal self-worth. That's where they would learn love and trust. One sister, when asked to try to articulate, to give us the experience of how a young child might view it, said in a quivering voice, picture a little body in monsters' hands. A father can put his hands where they ought not be once, and it will alter that child's world forever. But why do the wounds persist? Look, we're in the truth. We've been here for years. We have Jehovah. We have the hope. Why might they persist? Open your Bibles to Proverbs 22:6, a familiar scripture to parents. You may not have looked at it this way before, and it may not sink in at first, but when it does, you'll never forget it. Proverbs 22:6 says, train up a boy according to the way for him. Even when he grows old, he will not turn aside from it. That's an axiom. It's a self-evident truth. When parents train up a child in Jehovah's ways, most of the time, they will not turn aside from it. What that scripture illustrates is that parental influence lasts a lifetime. Well, what if the parental influence was sexual invasion? What if they were taught that they're powerless to prevent sexual intrusion? What if they were taught that they're dirty and worthless? Couldn't that lead to a lifetime of self-destructive behavior? Isn't that why the wounds persist? One of the most insidious effects of sexual abuse is the spiritual damage. Paul said in 2 Corinthians 7:1 that things could be a defilement of the flesh and spirit, and if there's anything that can defile a person's flesh and spirit, it would be sexual abuse. That's where the child's spirit, its dominant mental attitude, is contaminated, and it definitely impedes spiritual and moral growth. These kinds of severe abuse, then, is also spiritual abuse, because it taints the trust in a higher power. You may say, if it's so devastating, why do so many forget it or not talk about it? Well, the answer, or the question, really answers itself. It is so devastating that it must not be remembered. It must be pushed out. That's why 50% of people don't remember, 90% never talk about it. If the child could put together what this all means, it would be too much for him to even process. Jeremiah 5:21 is where Jehovah said to the Israelites, you have eyes but you can't see. You have ears but you can't hear. They were blocking out things. We do that. You do that. You block out things that you don't want to deal with. That same process happens to the child. They must, by reaction and protection, block out what was happening. And that blockage can continue through adulthood. And that's how they survive, through those type of mental processes those coping strategies. The reason why only 50% remember is because in their little minds they repressed it because it was too painful. They pushed it out of conscious awareness, and now they have selective memory gaps. Some sisters can't remember from age 4 to 12. It's gone. Or, if you can't repress the memory, denial may come in. See, maybe you remember the abuse, but what you will do is deny the feelings that it should evoke. Your feelings are frozen. You recall the abuse, but not the feelings that come with it. That's a protection. Or the dissociative process that doctors have researched. That's where the mind can separate from the body. Some have expressed that while they were being violated, they went somewhere else. They went into the picture of dolls on the wall. They went on top of the rocking horse and rocked while they were being violated. Well, that's an intricate mental process that saved them, but that can continue right into adulthood. That process, to its extreme, is what you've heard on many talk shows recently. They've now understood more multiple personality disorder. That's when events can be so traumatic, particularly with ritualistic kinds of abuse, that the child has to almost create another kind of person to deal with it, and then pushes it away because I can't deal with what just happened. A fragmented personality. Sometimes, as a defense mechanism, they turn all that pain against the abuser to themselves. Children have no previous history. Their tolerance for their parents is immense. It's much easier and less painful to blame themselves and be angry at themselves for the rest of their life, to let themselves be convinced that their favorite uncle could do this to them. Well, those coping mechanisms has made many victims of abuse survive. But as one sister said, the strength of my veneer continues to erode. Abuse creates a veneer, a kind of false self. And you can take on roles. You're not yourself. You're acting. But as you get older, many times in your 30s, that veneer starts to corrode. The body and mind can't hold this anymore. And the protective veneer melts. And in extreme cases, this is the kind of feeling. Another one of your spiritual sisters said, I'm scared of what's ahead. The pain I feel is unbearable, death so tempting. Why does it hurt so much to live? Her fear was brought on by recent flashbacks of horrendous child abuse. Flashbacks are a very frightening aftermath of sexual abuse and may start again when the person's in their 30s. But sometimes it's not just a picture, but it's an actual re-experiencing of the abuse. They feel it in their body. And it's extremely terrifying, and they certainly need support while they're going through it. But actually, flashbacks are an encouraging sign. Your brain has scanned things and has determined it might be safe now to tell my story. Memories can emerge in many different ways. One sister had hallucinations. She went to the eldest frantically, thinking she was being attacked by demons. At night, she would see shadowy figures and hear voices. But it wasn't the demons. It was that psychic trauma leaking out. And they can leak out all of your pores. They can leak out through all of the senses. Visually. You can hear things, taste things, smell things, feel things. So some victims of abuse, they could be driving down the road, hear a certain song, smell a whiff of cologne, and they go 30 years in the past in a total crisis. One sister, when kissed by her husband who hadn't shaved, the moment later was rocking as a child, screaming, and she now knew the abuser had a beard. Another sister said, sometimes when I lay in bed at night, I feel as if someone's on top of me. These are hideous after effects. Proverbs 14:13 says, even in laughter there is pain. Sometimes that's the case. Some victims of abuse are looking good. They're in the congregation, out in service, life of the party, seem in control of things, but inside something else is happening. Look good to the outside, but they're dying inside. Unfortunately, when you bury some feelings, all of them go, even joy. Job 9:27, according to the New English Bible, says, "If I smile and try to forget my pain, all my suffering comes back to haunt me." It is an absolutely exhaustive effort for child abuse and other kinds of abuse victims to repress these painful memories and pretend they didn't happen. Are there symptoms that even if someone doesn't remember they were abused, that there would be indicators? Do you have to remember the abuse to recover? Let me give you an illustration. Let's say you went home tonight, your front door was open, your dog was dead, your back door was smashed open, the TV was gone, the stereo was gone. Would you be convinced that you were robbed, that there was a thief in your house? Of course. Well, sometimes, even though you can't remember the abuse happening, there are telltale signs that convince you that it did. One of our sisters, this was the sister whose brother wrote to you that I quoted from. We'll call her Barbara. In the letter, he recalled how she used to be before they went to that house. He said, Barbara was always outgoing, outspoken, outwardly exuberant, always filled with life. And Uncle Victor liked that very much. She was his favorite, an aspect that was not in her best interest. Their new home was dark with sexuality. But today, our dear sister Barbara has no spontaneity. She's no longer exuberant. She's been depressed from that point on. Her marriage was destroyed by it. Coming to the Kingdom Hall is an ordeal. Going out in service, a very stressful event. An assembly, almost an impossibility. That shows something. Something someone is not aware of can still make him ill. One young sister commented, "But I don't have any memories." Well, she had no memories. But all of her adult life and in her childhood, she woke up screaming with night terrors, afraid of the dark, afraid to be alone. And that's a symptom of childhood sexual abuse. See, the psychic trauma that was caused by it is trying to be released in those dreams, but it's too much and it can't be. So it usually sets up a lifelong process of dreaming and nightmares, and the person never knows why. Other symptoms. Some feel alienated from their body, have a poor body image, or psychosomatic type symptoms, gastrointestinal problems, gynecological disorders, headaches, joint pains. Some wear a lot of clothes in the summer. Some have an extreme requirement for privacy. And the addictions. All kinds of addictions cover or try to repress these memories. Food problems, whether it's anorexia, bulimia, bulimorexia, or compulsive overeating. They try to starve themselves or eat themselves, trying to stay ahead of this pain. Whether it's drug addiction, alcohol overuse, or staying away from alcohol, whether it's spending and you can't stop, and you're breaking your family apart and you can't stop, cleaning, or sexual type problems, compulsive sexual behavior, maybe chronic masturbation, or addiction to pornography, or the inability to have intimate relations with your spouse. Self-destructive behaviors, phobias, suicidal tendencies, passive suicide, spiritual suicide, the sister that says, I don't want to go on anymore, I don't want to try. The inability to express anger, fear of losing control, fear of abandonment. You make an appointment with her to go out in service, you forget, you don't show up. She feels just as abandoned as she did 30 years ago. One of the most common effects are guilt, shame, and low self-esteem, which baffles many. Now, it may be hard to see how a 12-year-old whose father is forcing intercourse on her would feel guilt about it. But a child is unwilling to see the parent as bad. Someone has to blame for it. It's going to be me. And the perpetrator is all too willing, and most of the time, probably all of the time, brainwashes the person to think it is their fault and you are dirty. And if their body responds to this violation, responds sexually, the shame carried through adulthood, the feelings of dirtiness is paramount. Look, if I forced food down your throat that you didn't want to eat, your body would digest it anyway. You have no control over it. They know that intellectually I had no control over my body response and responding to it. That's what God made it to do. But the guilt still prevails. It's the lack of hope of ever being able to express this terrible trauma by means of the feelings that come with it that most often cause these kind of severe psychological, spiritual, and physical problems. All these kind of absurd behaviors and physical conditions have its root in childhood. Another sister said, I feel as though if someone presses too hard, I would cave in and crumble. The pressure for me to be a good Christian is too extreme, to the point of suffocation. This dear sister has no healthy concept of a father. Therefore, she has very difficult problems praying to Jehovah. She can't do it. She knows intellectually that he is. Everyone's told her. But to make the leap that he really cares, that he's a loving father, it's very hard to get emotional response. Well, what can you do? First, for the victims. This awake and this talk, know that it's an expression of Jehovah's love and sorrow. As elders in the congregation, we offer ourselves as help to you, even though it's in a very limited way. We'll pray with you, go over the article with you, and be there when you need us. In many cases, though, professional help is a must. Someone put a mark on your back, and you can't see it, and you need the mirror of therapy to see it, and the mirror of this wake to see it. And in most cases, even in very severe cases, the response to getting help is remarkable. One sister who, as a late teenager, had memories of her uncles abusing her. She went into a year-long horrible crisis. Now, after a year of getting help, she's a totally different person. She's on fire with the truth. Her life is full, vibrant. She's a spiritually growing, thriving person. To know that most of the time, healing is not an eternal struggle. Have the courage to heal. Know you're not alone, but never go it alone. It's time, maybe for you, to grieve this pent-up righteous rage. You have the right to. Your grief has waited for expression, and maybe this is time. Many brothers and sisters have gone before you. Know that the past has influenced you greatly, but it doesn't have to be an obstacle for your growth. Well, what about family and friends? Sexual abuse does not happen in a vacuum. Many things play a part as to the effects it'll have on a person. Its duration, its severity, the closeness to the abuser, the dynamics of the family. Is there support for the child? If the child tells, were they believed? Were they listened to? Were they protected? If so, the effects can be negligible. But when ignored, if mama closes her eyes, the damage is magnified. One sister who was molested by her stepfather is now more angry with her mother than her father, because the mother wore blinders and missed clues and closed her eyes. Until this day hasn't opened them. She's watched her be in agony for years and has never asked why. One mother said, "Why are you telling me this? What are you trying to do to me?" May that never be our response to a plea of a child. There is this kind of silent partner that almost guarantees the spiritual and emotional death of a child. I'd like to read you a quote and tell you who said it. It also gives us a very special secret pleasure to see how unaware people around us are of what is really happening to them. You know who said that? Adolf Hitler. His spiritual father believes the same thing. He gets a very special pleasure, secret pleasure, out of the unawareness of people and the atrocities that he's committing to them. But Jehovah God is not a God of secrets. The society is not a secretive organization. Did you notice when they wrote the article on sex education? Beautiful article. And they said that sex education, consider it a family secret. In response to a reader that wrote in, they said, well, let's change that to a private matter out of the concern for that dark secrecy. Neither should we be. We want to break out and help others break out of the prison of absolutely dirty secrets. Well, does that mean that families shouldn't touch? Should we be paranoid, not touch our children, not touch the relatives' kids? If Jesus had children, his house would be filled with touch. If Satan had children, his house would be filled with touch. But quite different. Satan's house would be filled with perverted, dark secrets and sexual touch. Jesus, his family would be getting healthy touches that children need. When a family doesn't have touch, when children doesn't get this needed touch, they become angry and deprived children. And they join the ranks of the walking wounded. You can see and almost pick out children who are never touched by their parents in a healthy, lofty way, can't you? It's absolutely needed. But affectionately, not sexual. No touch means they'll walk with a hole in their soul. Of course, physical expression to children changes as the child grows older. As a father's daughter grows older and starts developing, obviously, the way he touches, hugs, and cuddles would change. At this point, some fathers may pull away and leaving the child feeling abandoned. But teenagers need you more than ever. They need to know that you still care and love them. They still need appropriate touches. A pat on the back, a warm kiss on the cheek, an expression of I love you. But if lofty feelings ever left you towards your children because of maybe your needs not being met, or if it happens in the future, get help now. Don't delude yourself. If your lofty feelings towards your children or others' children ever change, then we would get help immediately. Our children's future depends on it. Incest simply doesn't happen in open, loving, nurturing, spiritual, communicative families. And in such families, if it did, by a babysitter, by someone at school, again, the way of the reaction of the family to the child, or to the adult who now is coming to terms with their memories, is paramount in their recovery. Again, depending on the support that they get, the effects could be negligible. To those who are suffering but not recovering, did you have a hard time with this talk? Did you have a hard time with this magazine? Did you read this magazine? Did you avoid it? Should you dig up the past? Maybe I can illustrate it this way. Let's say I found a document that proved unequivocally, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you were abused. Should I show it to you? Should I dig up the past? I would look at you, and if your life was going good, spiritually you're okay, happy person, in touch with how you feel about Jehovah, view him as a father, love your kids, able to express emotion to your kids, able to love the friends, your marriage is okay, marital intimacy is okay, your life is pretty much together. Forward-looking Christian. Put your hand to the plow and never look back. Things are going well. I wouldn't show you the document. But I might not throw it away. I might keep it. Just in case, 2 years down the road, you end up in a hospital, you end up having marital problems, and you don't know why. So maybe the key or a rule of thumb would be, if you sense that maybe something happened, and you want heart and soul, will it help me be made whole? I want to gain back what I lost, or the pain I feel it come, I say, so it can be done. Is it anger or is it rage? Please, dear God, let me out of this cage. What is this pain that I feel? Please help me touch it so I can heal. And we pray that Jehovah will be with her to heal. Well, we'd like to thank you for your listening to this part. This brings our meeting to a close. If this has brought up things that you'd like to talk to one of the elders or a trusted friend about, please do. Our song for the closing of this meeting is song